No son zesfenu medenolo supu prosoli honesti tozen totelo sochronos.
So today we're going to be talking about the tradition of philosophy sometimes called Presocratic. This is a bit of a funny name in a way because it suggests that there's something really different about philosophical activity before Socrates of Athens, uh, whose name is the Socrates in Presocratics. But I'm hoping to explain a little as we go about why that name is significant as we look at some preliminaries of understanding Presocratic philosophy, especially how we use our evidence and how we can recognize philosophy when we see it. So let's get started. We're focusing on the Archaic and Classical periods, again, in this case about 600 to 500 BC. And in looking through these preliminaries, we're going to spend a little bit of time with how we can approach our written evidence. And since we're looking at a time when some scholars think philosophy as such really gets off the ground, we'll explore how we can recognize philosophy when we see it, both from a modern and ancient perspective. That'll bring us partly to a theme of the boundaries between philosophy and myth, if there are any, and the boundaries between what the ancients called inspiration and investigation, in Greek, enthusiasmos and historie. So beginning with a look at how to approach our evidence for Greek philosophy. Some of our key sources include, in particular, manuscripts copied in the European Middle Ages. This is where most of our Greek philosophy comes from. Manuscript is a word that literally in Latin means something scripta or written, manus, by hand. So we're talking about texts that were copied out by hand, often on parchment, generation by generation, stuff that people thought was worth copying again and again after their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents had made copies. And that puts some interesting pressure on the texts that survive this way. They've got to be something that people thought for generations was important to work really hard or pay somebody to work really hard to copy out by hand. That's sort of interesting to think about. In a few cases, these manuscripts are texts that were used for something quite different in the Middle Ages. In one famous case, to write hymns on, but underneath had older writing that was nearly lost. One particularly celebrated case is what we now call the Archimedes palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that's been reused in that way. In this case, it turns out that a text of the ancient Greek mathematician and engineer Archimedes, who's famous for saying Eureka when he discovered a principle of the displacement of water, for example, he'd also discovered integral calculus or some of its prototypes or foundations, but the text where the proofs were carried out was later used to copy out hymns and so lost and forgotten. But some modern technology, thanks to NASA spectroscopy, was able to recover that underlying text, and we have a new chapter in the history of mathematics. We also have some evidence from ancient papyri, which are scrolls usually on papyrus rather than parchment, and we've got a lot less of this to go on. It's older than the medieval tradition, so sometimes it can help us as a control on medieval texts, but on the other hand, it's just rare. In a few cases, like in the pictured case from Herculaneum, we have papyri that actually survive from a library, in this case saved by the ash after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but this is also pretty rare. Mostly they're in the sands of Egypt where it's dry enough for them to be safe. In just a handful of cases, we also have a bit of philosophical evidence from stone, from epigraphy. One really outstanding case is Diogenes of Oneanda's Epicurean texts, but those again are an exception rather than a rule. We don't have a lot of that to work with. And a lot of what we work with is actually fragments and testimonies from different authors. In some of the cases of the Presocratics in particular, their texts haven't come down to us, but quotes about them have. So to talk a bit about some of the cases where we're fortunate, a small percentage of classical authors made it from antiquity through some of those epic destructions of libraries and more humdrum neglect through the medieval tradition to be printed in the early printed editions in the Renaissance and early modern period. A standout example in philosophy is Plato. In the case of Plato, we've got about 600,000 words of Greek, most considered genuine, and thinking about those pressures that apply to the survival of these texts. In the case of Plato, his rhetoric, his writing, his mastery as a literary author of 5th century Athenian Greek was considered so stellar that he was preserved for generations as a school text. And there were also some really important cases, for example, in the 10th century AD, where just a few copies of Plato preserved the tradition for some dialogues made by philosophers who were interested in the underlying philosophy. But for the most part, we refer to these dialogues today by Stephanus numbers, as they're called, after the 1578 edition that was published by Henry Stephanus in Geneva. These numbers are usually in the margins of a modern translation or text. They're consistent across all editions of Plato, and you'll see them often cited by scholars. They're numbers like this: Apology 38a. That means a marginal number 38a in Plato's so-called Apology of Socrates, apologia meaning a defense speech. So what does the number mean? It means page 38 of Stephanus's edition, column A. It's just interesting to think that there's this one edition that all those manuscripts wound up being particularly popularly collected in for later posterity, that now is so familiar in so many translations. But the case of Plato is kind of unusual. So in a lot of cases, and this includes the Presocratics, what we mostly have is fragments and testimonies in other authors. They haven't come down through that whole tradition of transmission in the Middle Ages. Many of these fragments, in the case of the Presocratics, are collected in a publication that's become a classic, edited by Hermann Diels and Walter Krantz, called The Fragments of the Presocratics, and usually abbreviated DK for Diels-Krantz. In a typical modern textbook about the Presocratics, take for example Patricia Currid's Presocratics Reader, published by Hackett, you'll find these numbers included in parentheses. Whatever order the editor, say in this case Patricia Currid, has put the fragments in, the Diels-Krantz numbers will be there. So just to help to read these, since they're also pretty standard, you'll often find these letters with a number, B meaning a verbatim quotation, and A meaning third-party testimony. Frequently you'll get a form like this, 80b1. That means Diels-Krantz chapter 80, which is about Protagoras of Abdera, by the way, the sophist of the 5th century BC, B meaning a verbatim quotation, and 1 meaning it's the first verbatim quotation in Diels-Krantz's chapter on Protagoras. So that's one kind of pressure to think about on the evidence that we have. It's often fragmentary and partial, and there's just a handful of texts that have come down intact, like Plato, through the medieval tradition for us to work with today. Another perspective to consider is the social perspective of the authors that come down to us, or the extant texts that we have in full. With a few exceptions, most of these are literate authors, male authors, relatively wealthy or privileged authors, and in some way informed by the literary tradition of Athens, rather than another Greek polis. So that's something to bear in mind when we're reading them as we try to explore how we think about them, how we understand their perspective or their vantage point. Another kind of perspective we can try to control for, especially with philosophers, is their own philosophical outlook, how they think about the world, and how it structures their view about their predecessors and contemporaries. And this is particularly important with philosophers who are essential to us because they preserve or relate or draw attention to philosophy before themselves. Maybe the paradigm case here is Aristotle. Aristotle himself and the school that followed him, including generations of commentators on philosophy with a whole view of the history of philosophy, did a lot to shape the conceptual structure of the history of philosophy in antiquity. Aristotle himself, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the series, was a pupil of Plato working in Athens, and his school, the Lyceum, sparked generations of study. It was one of the inspirations for the library or museon in Alexandria. Coming to the philosophy, Aristotle thought of philosophy itself as a search for causes. In Greek, aitei. You might recognize this in our English word etiology. And philosophy, at least the domain of philosophy or metaphysics that's concerned with causation fundamentally, is particularly engaged with a search for causes that are most basic or fundamental, causes at what Aristotle calls the arche, the source. You might recognize this word arche in our words like architectonic or archaeology. So coming back to the source, back to the beginning. And for Aristotle himself, there's at least four important modes of causation or explanation, four modes of iti that we can talk about when we try to understand any phenomenon. One is material causation, to borrow the Latin translation. In Aristotle's terms, this is, in a way, the raw potential out of which a phenomenon arises. It could be anything, and it turns out to be something. But that could be anything, that's in a sense matter, that out of which. To give an example that was important in the Aristotelian tradition, a house comes to be out of timber or wood. That wood could have been something else, maybe a lovely statue of a Greek god, woodwork to perfection, but it became a house. That could be that wood that could be something else. That's that out of which. And it's a kind of cause. If you asked why is it a house, you can say because it's wood, not cotton candy. A second kind of causation significant for Aristotle is called in Latin formal causation, but in the original Greek, it's the pattern or blueprint according to which the phenomenon arises, or kata which the phenomenon arises. Going back to the house, this would mean the blueprint of the house. The architect thought of this blueprint, worked it out, got some wood, let's say, rebar and other stuff, if we were thinking of a modern house, and brought that blueprint into being in the medium of this wood. A third kind of causation or answer to why questions that Aristotle brings up is where the oomph comes from. In Greek, where the kinesis comes from, the change or the motion. So yes, we've got this pattern or blueprint, we've got the wood or the out of which, and then what gives the impetus that brings that pattern about in that medium, that gets that wood put together housewise. In this case, let's say it's the builder's energy that makes it happen. But that's also an answer to a why question. Why is there a house there? Well, it's wood, not cotton candy. Or it's structured housewise and not sphere-wise. Or because somebody did the work to make it so, to bring that wood into that form. And the fourth of these kinds of answers that Aristotle thinks is important is in Latin final causation, but more literally in Greek, the who heneka cause, or the for the sake of what, or even for the sake of whom kind of cause. In the case of a house, it's usually shelter, shelter from the elements, let's say. And there's other kinds of final causation that Aristotle talks about too. But that's another kind of answer to the why question about the house. For Aristotle, we can ask these questions about most phenomena in nature. What's the raw potential they came out of? All those cells, let's say, could have been a multicellular organism, but they might have been something else too. In that sense, they're the matter or the potential for something. Likewise, the molecules that went to make the cell could have been something else, but they became a cell. They were organized cell-wise. That takes us to the second kind of causation. Being organized cell-wise, let's say, means having the blueprint of cellness that's instantiated in that potential, in that matter. The efficient causation gives the oomph for that, let's say again, matter or medium to be organized according to that pattern. And this is the one that's particularly tricky in some ways. For Aristotle, there's usually a final cause or a for the sake of what cause in nature as well. So why are we talking about this when we discuss evidence? Because Aristotle's so important for these earlier histories of philosophy, which he really contributes to and gives impetus to, because he thinks it's important to try to understand them. You could say he's the efficient cause of a lot of history of philosophy this way in the tradition that he reports. And in the case of, let's say, the philosophers of Miletus, Aristotle thinks that they're really concerned with, in his terms, material causation. And that means that his interest in them, what he quotes from them, is really colored by his philosophical perspective. On the other hand, he thinks the Pythagoreans are really interested in formal causation or patterns, and in a way that helps to understand why he quotes what he quotes from them. So in that sense, we can see that his philosophical interests also shape the evidence that we have. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We can be grateful to the Aristotelians who recorded this historical information for us, but it's something for us to be aware of when we think about it. when we think about what they actually said and how that knowledge comes to us, because these interpretations shape our testimony in general. Okay, so that's a little bit about evidence in general. I'd like to come next to looking away at some modern and ancient perspectives on one particular, let's say, angle in this evidence, which is where the line can be drawn between myth and philosophy. This is a tricky one. We're especially looking at the 6th century BC. That's a time when some moderns have suggested, moderns, let's say in the 20th century, that science or philosophy really got off the ground as distinct from mythology, which we've talked about a little earlier in this series. Some modern views suggest that there's something new here, particularly because it's not so anthropomorphic, that is, oriented around gods conceptualized as motivated in a human-like way, or because narrative has been removed and replaced with something more predictable. So in the philosophers we'll talk about at this point in the series, like the Milesians, there's a sense that maybe something's really new. When we go back to antiquity, though, as we'll see, even in very early antiquity, it's not so clear that this kind of contrast between mythic narrative and philosophical laws or generalizable patterns is so clear. There is an important contrast to the Greeks between divine and human kinds of wisdom, which, as we'll see, sometimes can map to myth and philosophy in our sense, but it's very, very different, and both are valid. There's also later ancient Greek views we'll see, for example, in the Platonic tradition, where the whole concept and terminology, philosophy, is constructed in a particular social milieu for the first time. And it may have existed earlier, it certainly did in some broader sense, but there's some pretty good arguments that a lot happened in the 4th century to give structure to this idea. And we'll see that that's a little different too. So we'll just offer some of these points to give us a bit of background as we go into looking at the Presocratics themselves. Just to reiterate, we're going to look at modern perspectives on what happened in the 6th century. We're going to look at some early ancient perspectives, and we're going to close with some later ancient perspectives on what philosophy is about in this time period and in general. So modern views first. Here's some quotations that are particularly vivid. Throwing off the vast symbolic visions of mythology, waking clear-headed to see and touch real things, a logos or explanation, not a mythos or story. That's from Francis MacDonald Cornford's From Religion to Philosophy, talking about what's happening in this century on his view. Again, this is W.K.C. Guthrie, a little bit later in A History of Greek Philosophy, thinking back to the myths of Hesiod and Homer. Well, a world ruled by anthropomorphic gods who are human in their passions, that was a world ruled by caprice, that is arbitrary. But philosophy and science have to start with a bold confession of faith that not caprice, but an inherent orderliness underlies the phenomena, and the explanation of nature is to be sought in nature itself. So, holding those in view, there's a sense that something was happening in the regions we'll be talking about in a few minutes, around the coast of Anatolia, the Eastern Mediterranean, a search for patterns of causation that broke in some way radically, or at least systematically, with earlier myth, because rather than looking to somewhat arbitrary motivations of human-like gods as the explanation or etiology of phenomena in the world, there was a search for more orderly, predictable, and regular patterns in nature. And as we'll see, there's some reason to think this is true for the physicists of Miletus or for the medical schools that develop around this time and a little later, maybe most famously associated with the name of Hippocrates, whose name is still behind the Hippocratic Oath. To give an example, thinking of Hippocrates in particular, it's possible to draw the line in a few ways between earlier medical thought, we could say, and Hippocratic medical thought, or again, thinking of some other kinds of genres between earlier cosmological thought and later medical thought. One argument could be a lack of appeal to mythic narratives with anthropomorphic motivation. Another could be that one hypothesizes recurring patterns that are predictable as causes rather than unpredictable narrative patterns. Another could be the appeal to shareable observations rather than a kind of unique access to a revelation in the sense of a divine epiphany or inspiration. We should also be sensitive to how these contrasts are used, particularly with modern perspectives that, at least in the 20th century, tried to set apart some ways of knowing as legitimately scientific and others, including more oral or traditional ways of knowing, as less scientific. And those efforts can have their own motivations as well. With that sensitivity in mind, we can take as an example, again, something from Hippocrates, this very early medical thinker around the 5th century BC, who's borne a real influence on subsequent medical developments. Hippocrates is credited with a treatise called On the Sacred Disease, which is about epilepsy, as we would call it today. And up to a point, epilepsy had been called the sacred disease because it seemed to arise from divine intervention. Hippocrates argued this. This is how it is when it comes to the disease called sacred. He said, "It seems to me that it's not at all more divine or sacred than other diseases, but it has a natural cause, originating like other affections do. Human beings think its nature and its cause divine because of ignorance and wonder." So this kind of passage can give weight to that modern interpretation that there's something kind of new going on in these centuries, contrasted with the explanatory modes of myth. And similar developments are suggested as well across the board in these centuries in natural philosophy, literature, history, and human motivation. A good example is the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. Herodotus, for example, introduces his own historiae or inquiry into the causes of particularly the Greco-Persian wars as a study of etiae or causes, much as Hippocrates is looking into the natural causes of diseases. So Herodotus's history begins, this is the display, apodeixis, of the inquiry, that's historiae, where we get the English word history, of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that human actions aren't forgotten in time, and great and extraordinary deeds, some by Greeks, some by foreigners, don't lose their renown, including, among others, the cause or etiae of their waging war upon one another. This doesn't exclude divine etiology, but it does demonstrate this kind of curiosity about causation and regular patterns of events that we see in medical thinkers as well around this time. So that's a bit about that modern view of a significant break between myth and philosophy as a search for causes, and some of the ways that that view could at least be amplified with reference to ancient sources from the period. Early ancient views are quite different. So going back to the Homeric poems, back to the 8th century BC, there's the idea that the search for etiae or causes is important, and that gods are the true causes, even if human beings can seem that way. There's lots of great examples in the Iliad. For example, when Priam, the king of Troy, says to Helen of Troy, who in a way could be, from the point of view of some of the Trojans, held responsible for the Greek attack on Troy. You, he says, are not Aitae as far as I'm concerned. It's a god who is Aitaion for this war, for these events. And the poet gives us reason to think we should believe that too. There's lots of similar cases throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. Vivid cases come up on the battlefield where we know, as the hearer of Homer's song, that arrows and spears flying around and crashing into shields seem to be thrown by humans, and they are, but the outcome, for example, whether that spear lodges in the shield or goes safely to the other side, is a matter of a god or a goddess brushing away the spear or the arrow as lightly as, in one beautiful passage, a mother brushes a fly from her child's cheek. So the gods and goddesses are really determining the outcome here. Usually humans can't see that. But in another memorable passage, in the 5th book of the Iliad, around 127 to 8, the goddess Athena comes to a hero she favors, Diomedes, and says that she'll take away the achlus, or mist, that conceals the action of the gods from human beings, so that through epiphany they can see the way things really are. They can actually see the gods in action. This drawing aside of the mist so you can see the true causes, this is also the action of epiphany or inspiration that the muses offer to Hesiod, or Athena again to Achilles or Odysseus, heroes that she favors, and other gods when they appear in epiphany are engaged in a kind of act of inspiration or revelation to a human being. This is also a significant precursor of the distinction between reality and appearance that will motivate so much Greek philosophy, whether it is the idea that natural particles interact according to certain forces in reality, but it appears to us that the ordinary sensory world arises, or it's Plato's theory that we're living in a kind of sensory illusion and the deeper patterns of reality are the actual truth, or any of these kinds of cases where there's a vision of some appearance as we see things and a deeper reality under the surface, even if that deeper reality is atoms in space, as Democritus suggests. All of those cases, and philosophy is the quest to find the underlying reality that's hidden somehow, and thereby also it's divine somehow. All these can be traced back to these really vivid passages in Homer where the divine causation is somehow disclosed. In addition to that kind of divine causation or wisdom that can be disclosed to humans, humans can educate one another in this early conception of wisdom. Going back to the Iliad again, there's a memorable scene where Phoenix is trying to recall for Achilles, who's busy in his tent, not helping the Greeks at the moment. Well, he tried to educate him to be a good speaker of words and doer of deeds. And his education consisted then, as his persuasion of Achilles does now, in the use of paradigmata or exemplars from mythology. Don't you see what that hero or that god did or would do in a case like this one? And in a way, that too is drawing on traditions of inspiration that come down through a poetic tradition in order to adapt, develop, or improve human experience. Human beings do have choice even in this world where the true causes are divine. And that's important to remember because we also have responsibility. That's a point that Plato raises as well. But what I'd like to stress here is that in the very early ancient context, these poets and the characters that they disclose to us wouldn't frame the development of 6th century philosophy as a sudden break from myth or narrative telling. They would, however, keep a strong distinction between divine wisdom and human understanding. And that's something we're going to see in later ancient sources as well as we go forward. So that's the contrast I'd like to suggest we remember from earlier antiquity. Going forward a little bit to the later ancients, uh, the ancient philosophy that we talk about is a kind of, it's framed by a category that Plato and Isocrates, not to be confused with Socrates, sounds like the Apple version of Socrates, a contemporary of Plato, developed in the 4th century. The distinction of science from philosophy as such is much later, natural philosophy having been science up until about the 19th century CE. But this idea that philosophy as a category and a term is really developed and constructed in the 4th century is well argued in some scholarship, for example, Andrea Nightingale's Genres in Dialogue. Here, too, we're not talking about philosophy contrasted with myth in the sense of a fabulous narrative. But Plato does often offer a contrast between two valid ways of knowing. One whose possessors can provide a logos explanation or account of what they know, and another whose possessors cannot offer a logos explanation or account of what they know. For instance, poets who are divinely inspired might tell you the truth because they've had a kind of disclosure or revelation from a god that just came to them in a moment of inspiration. But if you press them to explain, if you ask them questions, they may not be able to explain that knowledge further. However, if they develop a capacity to explain, expand on, and answer questions about what they know, whatever the source of knowledge, that's philosophy. That's the kind of curiosity that Socrates is trying to practice in Athens. But the goal here isn't to invalidate that divinely inspired, rooted knowledge. In fact, in Plato, and I think this is sometimes underemphasized, there's sometimes privilege given to knowledge that flows from inspiration, even and in some ways, especially by Socrates. So Mark McFerrin's work on the religion of Socrates and how he listens to his daimon and to the Pythia, for example, at Delphi, really brings this out too. So that's one contrast to think about in Plato in this construction of philosophy in the 4th century. It's not so much, even though there is this kind of distinction between poetry and philosophy that's operative, a distinction between mythic narrative and philosophical exegesis or interrogation or argument. Instead, there's a distinction between these two ways of knowing and how we can encourage uh, philosophical reflection, question asking, and answering whatever the source of our knowledge is. Another important contrast for Plato is of philosophy and rhetoric, where rhetoric can be political, literary, or otherwise a sort of persuasion to belief that presents a false illusion of truth, that presents an opinion as the truth and creates the danger that we might act on a false belief. That's really nothing to do with myth, although sometimes Plato does think that poets can do this. They can present through rhetorical argument, or really not argument, just rhetorical verve, an image or an appearance, let's say, that isn't true and deceive their audience. And political speakers can do this too. And Plato again thinks that asking questions and pressing speakers is valuable in seeing whether there's a logos or an account of the knowledge available. Also, for Plato, as for Aristotle, Hesiod and Homer and other poets can be seen as philosophers who are just working in a different medium or form. Their ideas are somehow implicit in narrative and might require interpretation or exegesis. There's actually some beautiful ancient passages about that we'll talk about a little bit later. In and of itself, the ancient word philosophy means to be curious, to love to learn. Herodotus uses the word in this way, for example. In the 5th century, sometimes with Socrates acting so curious in Athens, the word Socratein would be applied to him just to behave like Socrates. In the pages of Plato, Socrates suggests that philosophein, or being philosophical, is a matter of encouraging people to better their psyche, to ask questions in the way we talked about just a moment ago. For Aristotle, again, there's a sense that philosophy involves the search for understanding. Um, so all of that hopefully gives a little bit of an illustration to the idea that the accent in the 5th and 4th century construction of philosophy is on this kind of question asking, on this longing to understand, but not in and of itself, again, on the difference of form or source of knowledge between what we might think of as myth and philosophy. One more thing to say while we're on the topic is that in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, a division of philosophical inquiry became fairly consistent over time that can help us when we look back at earlier philosophy, even if it's anachronistic, even if it doesn't fully apply. It's a division between logic, physics, and ethics in the Greek sense. Logic, this is logikon from the word logos, has to do with how we communicate, persuade, make valid inferences, and get knowledge about things. So in a way, what we call epistemology today, as well as what we call logic today, is included here, and some of rhetoric as well. In Greek, physics, as another aspect of philosophical inquiry, physikon, from physis, which means nature or growth principle, in a way the sound a plant makes when it bursts out from the soil is phuo, I'm growing. Well, that's physis, that's nature. The study of physics, everything in nature, what really exists and how it appears to us, is also an important division of philosophical inquiry for the ancients. And then ethics, ethikon, which comes from the word ethos for habit or character. This is about human character as well as decision, and certainly includes ethics in our sense, just as physics includes physics in our sense, but is a little bit more. It's kind of broadly ontology, what there is in the world. So these three, although they're a bit different from how we use those three words, are a way of thinking of in practice, how philosophical discourse came out for the Greeks. Some of it seemed like it was about communication, persuasion, inference, and knowledge. Some of it seemed like it was about, well, what's really there anyway? And some of it was about, how should we live in that case? What's human character like, and how do we make decisions? So when we're looking back at some of these sources, what we might call mythic or philosophical, we can ask, what's their logic, what's their physics, and what's their ethics? This, by the way, comes from, it's already present in Aristotle's Topics, but it really is a Hellenistic division that comes up with the Stoics and their contemporaries, and is generally retrojected later as a good division of philosophy. I'll close here with a few quotes and then a little bit about the definitions of philosophy in antiquity. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that for Aristotle and Plato, it's possible to see the poetic underlying sources of Greek myth, like Homer and Hesiod, as in a way philosophers, but implicitly so. And here's a few quotes that bring out how that's the case and what they think we should do. This one is from Synesius in late antiquity, a pupil of the Neoplatonist teacher. Her name was Hypatia, student of Theon in the Neoplatonist school. Whether a saying, paroimia, counts as something wise, well, why not? Aristotle says about sayings, these kind of short, pithy sayings, like know thyself, that they are remnants of an ancient philosophy, saved by their brevity and acuity when it was lost in the great destructions of humankind. Similar ideas seem to go back to Aristotle and Plato. So Aristotle in Metaphysics book Lambda puts it like this: fragments of the thought of very ancient thinkers have been handed down to us in the form of myth, to the effect that, in the context he's talking about, the planets are gods, and the divine embraces the whole of nature. The rest has been added later in a mythological form to influence the beliefs of the vulgar, that is, people who aren't necessarily looking at these things with what Aristotle considers philosophical sensitivity, for the benefit of the laws and for pragmatic reasons. And that's where the anthropomorphism about the gods might come from. But if we separate out and take only the first claim, that they thought the first substances or realities to be gods, we must regard that as a divine saying and reflect that since every art and philosophy has probably been repeatedly developed to the utmost and has perished again, Aristotle has this idea that human cultures rise and collapse and rise again, collapse again, and rise again. Through those destructions, these beliefs have been preserved as relics. To this extent, only through interpretation we can see the opinion of our ancestors and of the first human beings. So Aristotle's idea here is that there have been philosophers, in his sense at least, in pretty much every human development of culture, but when those developments collapse and only a few human beings survive the process, memories in the form of short sayings, myths, and stories survive. And when cultures begin to develop again and more systematic philosophy develops again, through reflection and interpretation of those myths and stories, it's possible to recover the truths that the ancients knew, which is an interesting way of looking at philosophical history as well. This theme will come up for us as well in this part of our series as we think about hermeneutics or interpretation of enigmata in Greek, the source of the English word enigma, that is, wise sayings or oracles, and how trying to interpret oracles and sayings is kind of like interpreting life. Socrates brings up a theme like that when he points out that his life's work has been a kind of interpretation of an oracle from the Pythia at Delphi. So this is the last sort of bonus I'll leave you with about ancient views of philosophy, though it may not necessarily seem like a bonus. I think it's fun that we actually have all these definitions from the past of what philosophers thought they were doing. This is a collection of definitions from the School of Alexandria in the 6th century AD, but it collects some material from much, much earlier, some of it Platonic or Presocratic. So one idea, which is very Aristotelian, is that philosophy is knowledge about reality. And that's an idea we'll get sometimes today as well. In particular, the notion of causation, trying to understand causation and explanation. The second definition this school offers is that philosophy is a knowledge of the divine and the human. In their language, this means, and this also is heavily indebted to Plato and Aristotle, the knowledge of facts about the world and ourselves that are constant and not contingent on anything, that are, we might imagine like natural laws and constants, but in a way including metaphysical constants that are always the case. That's divine truths. Then there's human truths. Those are, for them, truths that are changing and contingent, that are up to us, especially ethical facts. So you might almost think here of some aspects of the most eternal in physics, in the Greek sense, and then some ethics. The third is a heavy one. Philosophy is a preparation for death. This comes out of Plato's Phaedo in particular. The idea here is that philosophy, through bringing us closer in a way to the divine in the sense just given, an understanding of the deeper, constant, and eternal, non-contingent truths in the world, through that very kinship prepares us for our own immortality. So there's a kind of intrinsic optimism in this that we'll also talk about, for example, when we read Pythagoras, who believes in human immortality and thinks of human beings as, in a way, rooted patterns, unique and eternal. Philosophy is becoming like the god. This one comes out of Plato's Theaetetus 176b, homoiosis to theo, likeness to the divine, as far as is possible for a human being. A similar theme. Philosophy is the skill of skills and the science of sciences, techne technon, episteme epistemon. In this sense, philosophy is seen as a kind of master craft that's capable of reflecting on every skill and every science and seeing how they all fit together. And of course, etymologically, philosophy is the love of wisdom, philosophia, being curious, longing to understand. There's two more. These are additional. They're not part of the official definitions given by the school because they think they're reducible to the first six, but they're lovely. One, that philosophy is the medicine of the soul, that is the psyche. The word psyche here is often translated as soul. It's the life principle, and it's also the seat of our consciousness, just as medicine is the philosophy of the body. So philosophy helps to heal or develop our psychology in the way that medicine can do for our body. And then last but not least, philosophy is the greatest kind of music. And if nothing else does, this would really help to set us up for the study of the Pythagoreans, for whom this is especially true. Again, these definitions that we've explored are sort of a bonus that might help us to think a little bit more about where we've been in this part of the series. So just to sum up, we've looked at some modern and ancient views of philosophy and wisdom. We've talked a little bit about the use of our evidence as a preliminary to the study of the Presocratics. We've looked at the boundaries between philosophy and myth, whether it's even possible to draw such boundaries, and the way in particular that inspiration and investigation for the ancients themselves are more significant categories to use than narrative myth and investigative philosophy when we look at what's new or developing, especially in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. So we'll move next to look at some of those philosophers in those centuries who developed these new ideas.
No